All right, you guys. Welcome back to another reading hour. So, picking right back up on the Gladio book. It's the reading hour for September 15th. I'll read the last paragraph that we left off on. We left off on a section called Sindona's Family. In Palermo, Kenny and company came to learn that Salvatore Inzerillo, Sicily's leading heroin smuggler, served as the capo di tutti capi of this extended crime family, a position he assumed after Rosario DiMaggio died of a heart attack. Inzerillo and his sister were married to Spatolas. Salvatore's uncle Antonio, along with his cousin and namesake in New Jersey, were married to Gambinos. His cousin Tommaso was a brother in law of John Gambino, who was married to a different Gambino. The Sicilian clan inhabited the Paso di Regano section of Palermo. The American clan lived in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Interesting stuff. All those New Jersey Italians, New York Italians, they're all mobbed up. Okay, so then picking back where we left off. Describing the inner dimensions of the four families, Italian prosecutor Giusto Scacciatano wrote, "These four families form a single clan unlike anything in Italy or the United States, the most potent family in Cosa Nostra. John Gambino is the converging point in the United States for all the group's activities in Italy and the final destination for its drug shipments. Salvatore Inzerillo has emerged as the Gambino brothers' principal interlocutor, the central personage in Sicily with myriad interests and heavy capital investments. Rosario Spatola is just below them in the structure. Stefano Bontade was an integral member of the clan. Through his ties with P2, the extended family gained the protection of Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti and, in turn, the CIA. Interesting stuff. Pays to have powerful friends in the Italian government or the CIA through the Propaganda Due Italian Masonic Lodge that also has like all the Vatican as members. Very good friends to have. Next section here is the drug bust. During his stay in Sicily, Kenny and his fellow prosecutors received word of Salvatore Inzerillo's latest heroin shipments to New York. They contacted agents of the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, who intercepted 5 kilos of heroin packed in talcum powder meant for John and Rosario Gambino. Interesting. The next shipment came from Sicily inside a truckload of lemons, which were then driven to Milan. Yeah, nobody suspects lemons in Milan, where the 91 pounds of heroin were packed inside a cargo container filled with Italian pop music albums and shipped off to the Gambino brothers in the Big Apple. When the second shipment reached the United States, the police moved in on the Gambinos. In March 1980, John and Rosario were arrested in their restaurant Valentino's for alleged participation in an international heroin smuggling operation. They were acquitted of those charges, but more than 60 members of the Sicilian mafia were eventually convicted in the case. So I guess all the lower guys take the fall. I guess that's how that hierarchy works. Inzerillo's end. The bust produced profound repercussions in Sicily. A substantial amount of the confiscated heroin belonged to the Corleonesi, the crime family of the Calogero Vizzini, or Don Callo, which was now headed by Luciano Leggio and Salvatore Toto Rina. The two capos demanded compensation for their loss, but Salvatore Inzerillo refused to cough up a dime. As men of respect, Leggio and Rina were bound to retaliate. Stefano Bontade was gunned down on April 23, 1981, while stopped at a traffic light in his Alfa Romeo. Salvatore Inzerillo was next. He was murdered on May 11th as he was about to step into his bulletproof car, after leaving the house of his mistress. What followed was a bloodbath. During 1981 and 1982, more than 200 members of the Inzerillo extended family became victims of the Upara Bianca, or white shotgun, a killing done in such a way that the body is never found, while the Corleonesi suffered no casualties. Thanks in part to the antics of Sindona, the clan had lost the protection of the Italian government and the overlords of Gladio. By the end of 1982, 72 men of respect with ties to Salvatore Inzerillo went on trial in Palermo, and warrants were issued for over 50 more soldati, or soldiers, and business associates, including Sindona. To top it off, the multi-billion-dollar Gambino Inzerillo Spatola holdings were seized by the state. Once you lose all that protection of the higher up, like the actual deep state, then the public version of the lawfare and the court system actually comes down on you. That's how that works. So, loss of family. Sindona had lost his family, and matters for the mafia financier continued to get worse. In addition to the charge of operating a $600 million a year heroin business between Sicily and the United States, he was charged with illegal possession of firearms, using a false passport, and violating currency regulations. To top it all off, he was also indicted for ordering the execution of Giorgio Ambrosoli, the chief bank investigator who tried to uncover the Vatican's connection to the mafia. Yeah, heavy charges. On January 25th, 1982, Sindona was indicted in Palermo, Sicily, along with 75 members of the Gambino, Inzerillo, and Spatola crime families. The indictment sprang from his ill-fated faked kidnapping and the trail he had blazed for investigators to follow, a trail that led from New York to Palermo. In the fall of 1982, after the raid on Gelli's villa and the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, Sindona finally broke and began to prattle from his cell at Otisville. He told Jonathan Beatty, a reporter from Time, quote, "Money was given to political parties, but money was sometimes under the table. Calvi feared his trips to South America because the communists, the Cubans, knew that Calvi with Gelli were building rightist strength in South America. That was our goal." Yeah, I mean, how many decades have people been talking about how the Cuban or like the mafia was involved in keeping the fascism alive, like trying to overthrow the communist revolution after it was successful, trying to stave it off, being very pissed off when it was successful, and then also using those same connections to like do the same shit in every other South American country they could get a foothold in. So Sindona went on to talk not only about the Vatican's subversive attempts to gain control of Ambrosiano, but also about his involvement in P2 and the secret society's support for right-wing guerrilla units. Taking the bait is the next section here. Alarms were sounded. The CIA dispatched Carlo Rocchi, one of its Italian agents, to monitor Sindona's behavior within the federal prison. Rocchi gained the mafia financiers' trust by presenting him with an affidavit from the Department of Justice. The affidavit said that Rocchi was a, quote, reliable person, and that President Reagan was prepared to grant Sindona a, quote, full pardon. Sindona could not believe that such an affidavit from a, quote, reliable government official would be bogus. He took the bait and refrained from making further statements until September 24th, 1984, when the U.S. Justice Department issued the order for his extradition to Milan. Upon hearing the news, Sindona went ballistic. He said, quote, "If I finally get there, if no one does me in first, and I've already heard talk of giving me a poisoned cup of coffee, I'll make my trial into a real circus. I'll tell everything." This is crazy shit to say. Like, if you're already hearing talk that you're going to be assassinated, and now we see the CIA faking that they're going to give you like a pardon so that you shut the fuck up and don't expose their own dirty deeds. And then you go and say shit like, "Well, I will talk more if I actually get to my trial." You're just begging them. You're like saying, "Please assassinate me. Make sure I don't get to that trial." But let's see how it pans out for him. Bold move. On September 25th, Sindona was transported to the Rebibbia prison in Rome, where he was placed in the maximum security cell that had been occupied by Mehmet Ali Agca. 5 days later, he was moved to the Casa Circondariale, or Femminile, in Voghera, on the outskirts of Milan, where he became the sole male inmate in a women's prison. Okay, yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like it's the name of a women's prison. Voghera, a maximum security facility, was trumpeted as a, quote, super carcere, or super prison. Barely 4 years old, it was the first fully electronic penitentiary in Europe. All right, so maybe he'll be all right. We'll see. Spilling his guts is the next section here. While awaiting trial, Sindona made contact with Nick Tosches, an American journalist who penned articles for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and the Village Voice. When the reporter arrived at Voghera, the caged Don began to spill his guts. He spoke of matters that never before had been revealed to the press, including the U.S. government's protection of the drug trade and how they had allowed, quote, dirty money to accumulate in the hands of a few men. Sindona maintained that U.S. agencies, such as the President's Commission on Organized Crime, functioned not to find dirty money, but rather to, quote, create it. He added that such agencies often captured, quote, intermediaries in the drug trade, but never the real, quote, crime lords, who had become, quote, the world's establishment. Yeah, I mean, imagine hearing that the deep state of these governments actually uses drug trafficking for its own benefit and profit. They don't actually fight the war on drugs. They're actually part of it. Who could have thought? So let's see. Sindona spoke of Gelli, P2, and the fear of an Italian communist dictatorship that gave rise to the strategy of tension. Yeah, they were so afraid of communist dictatorship they created fascist dictatorship and called it democracy. He said that he sent regular reports on developments within the Italian Communist Party to U.S. Ambassador Martin and the White House. Got to keep tabs on them. And he talked about the Vatican and the IOR's involvement in laundering dirty money. If you wish, you can go right now to Milan or Rome with $1 million, $10 million in cash with me, or some other Italian who knows his way around. In a matter of minutes, we would find any number of persons or organizations offering us their services to transfer the money abroad in Nero without risk. 10 minutes later, you would have confirmation that your money has been credited to you in the currency of your choice in Switzerland, Austria, or the Bahamas, minus a service fee. The Pope's Bank, the IOR, had been involved in such services since its founding. In general, the IOR catered to other banks, whose more privileged clients sought the added security and secrecy offered by Vatican channels. The IOR would open a running account with the Italian credit bank that wanted to export lira in Nero. The client of the Italian bank would deposit the lira in cash in that account, and the IOR would credit to him abroad in the currency and the bank of his choice. In the process, the IOR would deduct a commission that was slightly higher than the going rate. The Banca d'Italia and the other authorities never interfered, as they were convinced that the Holy See, if pressed, would respond that, being a sovereign foreign government, it was not under obligation to furnish any information to Italy 28. But Sindona, sorry, it would not furnish any information to Italy, and that was the footnote. There was just no period. Sorry. But Sindona was not completely candid with Tacius. Still clinging to the hope that the powerful political leaders he had served, including Prime Minister Andreotti, would effect his release, he did not speak of his pivotal roles in such enterprises as establishing the heroin trade between the Sicilian and American mafias, implementing the strategy of tension with the millions of dollars he had received from Ambassador Martin, creating massive financial holes for the disappearance of billions in cash, commissioning the killing of Giorgio Ambrosoli, and planning his own bizarre kidnapping. He also neglected to mention his long-standing ties with the CIA in a covert operation called Gladio. It was best, he thought, not to play all his aces. Yeah, I guess you got to keep something up your sleeve. So, trusting a mole is the next section here. Weeks before his trial for fraudulent bankruptcy, Sindona began to receive visits from P2 members who, no doubt, reminded him once again of his oath of secrecy to the lodge and how the Masonic Society was able to arrange Jelly's miraculous escape from the Champ Dolan prison in Switzerland. Sindona became subdued and underwent a change of mind about turning his trial into a, quote, circus. When the trial began on December 12, 1984, the mafia financier requested it proceed without his presence in the courtroom. The strange request was granted. On the Ides of March 1985, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The prosecutor, Guido Viola, calling Sindona, quote, one of the most dangerous criminals in judicial history, had asked for 15 years. Sindona's trial for the murder of Ambrosoli began on June 4th, 1985. It would drag on for 9 months, since the lead witness, William Arrico, whom Sindona had hired to make the hit, had died during an alleged, quote, escape attempt from a New York jail. In a letter to Rockhill, dated February 5th, 1986, Sindona wrote, quote, I want to talk about scandalous matters that constitute grave moral and penal irregularities about which I have remained silent until now to maintain the professional reserve to whom I have always wished to be faithful. Again, I think that's his really diplomatic way of saying he kept the good stuff secret until he absolutely needed to. Rockhill responded by writing, quote, let the great battle against you know who, begin, and let me have all the necessary documents. Take care not to forget anything, neither the national aspects nor the USA ones. Sindona, still unaware that Rockhill was a CIA agent, surrendered all of his notes and documents. Rockhill patted the prisoner on the shoulder and gave him solemn assurance that his release was imminent, despite the verdict in the murder trial. Sindona believed him. Okay, so maybe he will live. He's just going to stay in jail, I guess. But then I guess they're going to have to kill him. Like, if he actually gets sentenced and then sets foot in the jail, why wouldn't he then start talking? So they're just going to have to kill him, I assume. Let's see. The tortellini is good, is the next section here. When Tacius paid a visit to the prison on May 8th, he saw immediately that Sindona looked much better than he had in the fall. Quote, his brown eyes were bright, the reporter noted, and he had obviously gained some needed weight. He expressed no fear of the verdict and offered no lament of his fate. Instead, he patted his stomach and said, quote, the tortellini is good in this town. On March 18, 1986, Mercator Senatus Romanum Curium, the leading banker of the Roman Curia, was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. He was sent back to the prison at Voghera. 3 television cameras were installed in Sindona's solitary cell to monitor his every move. A cadre of 12 guards, working in shifts of 2, kept watch over him night and day. His food was prepared in a special kitchen by chefs under stringent supervision. Yeah, so they know. They see what's up. Mihana Avalanato is the next section here. On March 20th, Sindona rose from his cot to take breakfast. As always, his plastic plate and pressed foam coffee cup were sealed. It was 8:30. He carried the coffee cup with him through the door that led to the toilet. Minutes later, the Mafia Don emerged from the bathroom, his shirt covered with vomit, his face convulsed with horror. Quote, "Mi hanno avvelanato," he screamed. "They have poisoned me." I guess that's how you say that in Italian. These were his last words. Sindona was rushed to a nearby hospital where he was found to be in an irreversible coma. A lethal dosage of potassium cyanide was detected in his blood. That afternoon, a priest administered extreme unction. 48 hours later, Michele Sindona, the man known as, quote, St. Peter's banker, was dead. His death was only to be expected. Yeah, I just said that like a couple minutes ago. I was just saying this. They gotta kill him. The Gladio agents possessed the keys to every prison. They could manage the escape of Agsa from a cell in Turkey and Jelly from a jail in Switzerland. They could arrange the jailhouse deaths of Henry Arson of Stibum and General Santovito of SISMI. And they could poison the coffee of a celebrated mafiosi who remained in solitary confinement within a maximum security prison. Yeah. That really is like the whole... It always reminds me of that scene in like... what was it? Quantum of Solace was like that James Bond movie with Daniel Craig. And like the traitor just reveals himself in the interrogation room as they're interrogating somebody else that they caught. He like shoots Judi Dench, and she later remarks she survives it. And she's like, when somebody says we have people everywhere, because that's like what the interrogee, the person being interrogated says, he goes, we have people everywhere. And then like as he says that, one of Bond's own people shoots his boss. She's like, you think florists say that? Don't really take that seriously. You don't think they have somebody in the fucking room with you. But yeah, that's all I'm saying. They have people literally everywhere. They can bust anybody out of any prison or kill you there if they want to. Archbishop's arrest warrant is the next section. There were more matters for damage control. The goodwill payment to Ambrosiano creditors from the coffers of Opus Dei did not close the criminal probe of the massive bank collapse. On February 26, 1987, the investigating magistrates concluded that the Vatican Bank had acted as an umbrella for Roberto Calvi's illicit transactions, that it owned a substantial share of Banco Ambrosiano, as well as the dummy corporations, and that it was responsible for the theft of $1.75 billion. Arrest warrants were issued for the 3 top IOR officials, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, Luigi Manini, and Pellegrino del Strobo. It's crazy because you would think that you wouldn't have to deal with all this by killing that main guy that they killed, but I guess it didn't help. At least not as much as they wanted. Oh, wait, never mind. Next section here, or next sentence here. The arrests were not made. To protect its officials, the Vatican pointed to Article 11 of the Lateran Treaty of 1929 that served to regulate matters between the Holy See and Italy. The article stipulated that there should be no interference by the Italian government in, quote, the central institutions of the Catholic Church. Italy's highest court upheld the stipulation and ruled that Marcinkus and his 2 associates could not be arrested and brought to trial in Italy. The Vatican is its own little country. What can you do? The 3 Vatican bankers remained safe from extradition within the sanctity of the sovereign state of Vatican City. Marcinkus remained under papal protection until 1991 when he took up residence in Sun City, Arizona. Italian authorities throughout the next decade attempted to persuade U.S. officials to return the Archbishop to Italy so he could face a jury. But such efforts proved fruitless. The U.S. Justice Department made the strange ruling that Marcinkus possessed a Vatican passport and could not be extradited to Italy, even though his crimes took place on Italian soil. No one in the CIA wanted the guerrilla to testify in court about his ties to P2 and the Sicilian Mafia, nor about the transfer of funds to Solidarity, the opponents of liberation theology, and the right-wing regimes in Latin America. I remember Solidarity was like this Polish union, workers' union org, that was actually just this secret right-wing militant kind of thing. And they're also involved with the shit in Latin America. Like, when we say that these things are all tied together, like, we're not crazy. Like, the orgs are international in nature, and they move the money around, and the weapons, and the people. Let's see. And so he stayed sheltered from justice, not within Vatican City, but Sun City, Arizona. where he joined a prestigious country club, played daily rounds of golf, and smoked expensive cigars. He died of undisclosed causes on February 20th, 2006. Yeah, another one who just totally escaped any accountability. All right, so I'm at 20 minutes for this one. Let's see. So I'll bookmark that. The next section will be the gold bars. Let me pick that one up. So now we will switch over the Western Marxism book. When Jean-Paul Sartre initiated a protest in Paris against the massacre of Algerians, Foucault's friend Pierre Boulez took part, but Foucault himself did not participate. In general, the struggle against torture and the brutal repression with which the rulers tried to suppress the national liberation struggle plays no role whatsoever in Foucault's thought. As has rightly been noted, quote, his criticism of power remains focused on Europe. Even more, colonialism and colonial ideology are largely absent from the history that Foucault draws of the modern and contemporary world. Thus, for Foucault, quote, at quote, the end of the 19th century, we see the appearance of what might be called a state racism. And only the dawn of the Third Reich heralds the emergence of, quote, an absolutely racist state. Doubts about this periodization already emerge when we consider the abolitionists, who in the 19th century publicly burned the American Constitution, which they branded as a pact with the devil because it legitimized slavery, or those who accused the 1850 laws on fugitive slaves of trying to force every U.S. citizen to quote, become a manhunter. Those liable to prosecution were not only those who tried to hide or help a black person pursued by his legitimate owners, but also those who did not participate in the capture. To partially excuse Foucault, it might be argued that he did not know about this chapter of history, but then he might at least have read Marx's comment on the fugitive slave laws. Quote, to play the part of slave catchers for the Southern slaveholders appeared to be the constitutional calling of the North. In any case, we are not dealing here with racism that is manifested only at the level of civil society. The racial identity of a person is decided on the basis of explicit juridical and constitutional norms concerning a person's social position and his fate. As far as the United States is concerned, before the War of Secession, its racial state character was even more pronounced than that of the Third Reich. According to the Nuremberg laws, while the definition of a Jew included the affiliation of one or another ancestor to Jewish religious community, in the United States, religion played no role in defining who was black. The only decisive factor was blood. Quote, the one-drop rule. Hitler had no slaves, neither black nor Jewish, but almost all presidents in the first decades of the American Republic were owners of black slaves. If Foucault did not deal with the history of the United States, then he might have deigned to consider the history of the secessionist confederation or that of South Africa, or take an overall view. If one examines the capitalist countries together with the colonies ruled by them, it turns out that the phenomenon described by Ho Chi Minh for Indochina has a common character. There are two kinds of legislation, one for the race of the conquerors and the other for the race of the conquered. Seen in this way, the racial state accompanies the history of colonialism in its entirety like a shadow. The phenomenon is more evident in the United States only because of the spatial proximity in which the different races lived. However, Foucault is not interested in the history of the peoples in the colonies or of colonial origin. Yeah. Once again, boiling down like the legacy of Western Marxism versus Eastern Marxism to be, Western Marxism is only concerned with the Western ideals of democracy and liberalism and does not concern itself with the obvious race and colonial question that it operates at the benefit of. There's also the history that the French philosopher depicts in light of racial ideology. According to him, quote, late in the 19th century, in contrast to the tradition of historical accounts that strove to legitimize sovereignty, a completely new anti-authoritarian and revolutionary discourse prevailed, which divided society into struggling races or classes and introduced, quote, a principle of heterogeneity. The history of some is not the history of others. Sometime later, however, a turning point occurs. Quote, the idea of racial purity, with all its monistic, statist, and biological implications, that is what replaces the idea of race struggle. A real revolution. Quote, racism is quite literally revolutionary discourse in an inverted form. For Foucault, it is clear that, quote, they, revolutions, had their roots in the discourse of race struggle. From this picture, The centuries-long process of racialization and dehumanization that overwhelmed the colonized peoples have, quote, literally disappeared, as have the great struggles for recognition, beginning with the one that, in light of the radicalization of the French Revolution, led to the abolition of slavery in the colonies. I don't see the connection there. I mean, I guess you could say the French Revolution led to the abolition of slavery gradually. Is that how liberals interpret that? Finally, according to Foucault, quote, the great public ritualization of death gradually began to disappear in the late 18th century. In reality, in the United States, in the first decades of the 20th century, white supremacy was still manifested in the organized mass spectacles of the lynching of blacks. The spectacles were announced in the local press. Women and children were invited to attend and participate, and they ended with the distribution of souvenirs of the sacrificial rite. Yeah, they would literally hand out body parts of the person they killed. That's a souvenir. Absolutely barbaric pig people. The huge displacements that I have presented here are also reflected at the political level. When Foucault delivered the series of lectures under examination here at the Collège de France in 1975 to 76, the apartheid regime of racist South Africa was still very much alive. And about 10 years earlier, Hannah Arendt had drawn attention to the prohibition of marriages between partners of different, quote, races and other provisions of a similar nature that continued to apply in Israel, in paradoxical analogy with the, quote, infamous Nuremberg laws of 1935. But when Foucault sets out in search of another reality that he can place alongside the Third Reich in terms of, quote, state racism, he succeeds in locating it only in the Soviet Union, the country which, since its foundation, had made a decisive contribution to the emancipation of the colonial peoples, and which was also at the forefront of condemning the anti-black and anti-Arab policies pursued by South Africa and Israel in 1976. So yeah, even at that point, the Soviet Union was already far more progressive than any of the Western colonial countries, but you will never hear that perspective from any of the Western Marxists, any of the people who are socialists but not communists, or just like some kind of vague leftists or not anti-imperialists. It has been noted that Foucault significantly influenced Antonio Negri. Indeed, today distinguished American scholars describe the history of their country as that of a Herrenvolk democracy. That is, a democracy that applies only to the Herrenvolk. The use of Hitler's language is significant, and has not hesitated to enslave blacks and wipe out the, quote, redskins from the face of the earth. The book Empire, by contrast, speaks wistfully of a, quote, of an American democracy, unquote, that breaks with the, quote, transcendent idea of power characteristic of the European tradition. But the apologia does not end here. Take a figure as central as the history of U.S. imperialism as Woodrow Wilson. As he begins his career, Ku Klux Klan thugs are attacking blacks in his home in the South. But the future president takes up his pen to write an indictment of the victims in an article in the Atlantic Monthly of January 1901. The, quote, Negroes are, quote, excited by a freedom they do not understand, are, quote, insolent and aggressive, sick of work, covetous of pleasure. In any case, the, quote, sudden and absolute emancipation of the Negroes was a catastrophe. It had led to a, quote, very perilous situation, which Southern legislatures, that is, the whites, had to face with, quote, extraordinary steps, lynchings, and terror. So, yeah, cool. Woodrow Wilson here decides, while the Ku Klux Klan is operating with impunity, that he really has to write this article about this problem among black people just being too arrogant, just being too lazy and too comfortable with all this new freedom they were just so suddenly given. It shouldn't have given it to them that quickly, I guess. That's what he's saying. Not that anyone thought Wilson was a good guy. Wilson will always remain faithful to this ideological political platform under the sign of white supremacy and on a national and international level. In this context belongs the heavy cudgel with which Latin America was threatened and chastised. Nor should we forget that even relations with European allies were often characterized by an ungracious realpolitik. It is no coincidence that the young Wilson even attracted Bismarck's attention. All this did not prevent the U.S. president from intervening in the First World War in the name of the Universal Democratic Mission of the United States. It was quote, a holy war, the holiest of all wars, a, quote, transcendent enterprise, whose protagonists are the American, quote, crusaders. Yeah. Every fucking war the U.S. actually takes part in is to protect white supremacy or capitalism. Even World War II. There's a reason they entered when they did and acted the way they did. This unique combination of realpolitik and the idea of a religious mission, sealed by a privileged and direct relationship with the Lord, provoked the biting irony of Freud. But it makes recourse to an iron fist. Uh, but it makes recourse to an iron fist against a pacifist opposition all the easier. The repression in the United States was far harsher than that carried out at the same time in the Wilhelmine Germany. I guess that means they're under Wilhelm or Wilhelm. It is not by chance that this repression aroused the admiration of Mussolini, who was just then hurrying along the path that would lead him to squadrismo and fascism. In Negri and Hart, however, we read that Wilson is characterized by, quote, an internationalist ideology of peace, far from the, quote, traditional European style imperialist ideology. Not really. Why would Hart and Negri be so sympathetic to Wilson? The ideologues of Manifest Destiny have always insisted on the moral and political primacy of the United States, on its exceptionalism, that it was to be the only island of freedom in an infinite ocean of despotism. The argument of empire is not dissimilar. At this point, I would like to suggest a type of intellectual experiment, if you will, a game. We will compare two quotations. They come from two noticeably different authors, but they both try to contrast the United States against Europe in a positive way. The first praises the, quote, American experience and emphasizes the difference between a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and the nations of the Old World, which certainly were not conceived in liberty. And now the second, quote, was not American democracy, in fact, founded on the democracy of Exodus, on affirmative and non-dialectical values, and on pluralism and freedom? Did not these values, along with the notion of new frontiers, perpetually recreate the expansion of its democratic basis beyond every abstract obstacle of the nation, ethnicity, and religion? When Hannah Arendt claimed the American Revolution to be superior to the French because the American was an unlimited search for political freedom, and the French a limited struggle over scarcity and inequality, she not only celebrated an ideal of freedom that Europeans no longer knew, but also reterritorialized it in the United States. Which of these two passages quoted here is more apologetic? It is difficult to say, even if the second sounds more inspirational and lyrical. The second, of course, comes from the pen of Negri and Hart, while the first comes from Leo Strauss, the leading ideologue of American neoconservatism. Marx's observation concerning Bakunin comes to mind. For all his anti-statist radicalism, Bakunin ultimately spares England, the, quote, genuine capitalist state, the true apex of bourgeois society in Europe. The anarchism of our day goes even further than Bakunin in sparing the country that, in the eyes of a broad and growing worldwide opinion, has become synonymous not only with capitalism, but also with militarism and imperialism. A country that also embodies for prominent U.S. historians of a liberal tendency and a completely different, quote, exceptionalism than that invented by Strauss, Negri, and Hart. Quote, only in the United States was there a stable and direct connection between the ownership of slaves and political power. Only in the United States did slaveholders play a central role in the formation of the state and the creation of representative bodies. Scathing. Damn. No come back to that. At the time, Sartre denounced, quote, that super European monstrosity, North America. Empire, on the other hand, not only positively opposes the United States to Europe, but also supports Arendt's thesis of the clear superiority of the American Revolution over the French. In this black and white confrontation, of course, the deportation and decimation of the, quote, Redskins and the enslavement of the blacks, powerfully driven by the former revolution and abolished by the latter revolution, play no role. Hart and Negri, like, what was the role of, like, the minorities in the French Revolution? I literally never hear about that. Like, I hear some references that they, like, looked up to, like, did it take place after the Haitian Revolution, like after Dessalines, or I'd have to look it up, but it's just like it's so circle jerky. It's all just these, like, white Marxists looking at other white revolutionaries and then ignoring again all the entire global South, like the actually oppressed people. Okay, um, So Hart and Negri take no notice of the fact that Arendt had also dragged Marx into the dock together with Jacobinism. Marx, as the author of the quote, politically most pernicious doctrine of the modern age, as the person responsible for quote, an actual surrender of freedom to necessity. The latter had been influenced by quote, his teacher in revolution, Robespierre, and in turn had perniciously influenced quote, his greatest disciple, Lenin. And consequently, Hart and Negri, together with the unconditional condemnation of the two revolutions, the French and the Russian, that called into question the world system of slavery and colonial oppression, tacitly approved the liquidation of the philosopher who, when he condemns wage slavery in the metropolis, repeatedly refers, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, to slavery in the true sense of the word in the colonies. This constitutes the self-liquidation of, quote, Western Marxism. I guess that's him tying it all together in a nice bow, saying that like Western Marxism is self-contradictory and liquidates itself, cancels itself out because of the gaping blind spot in its analysis. Once again, pretty much the point of the entire book. At this point, the earlier distinction or opposition between quote Western Marxism. Oh, this next section is section 6, Western Marxism, comma Eastern Marxism. At this point, the earlier distinction or opposition between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism, formulated by Perry Anderson, needs to be re-examined. First and foremost, it is important to examine the different conditions in which one and the other had to act. Let us begin from 1917. In the West, Marxism was schooled primarily in condemning the destructive consequences, the slaughter and the burying of democracy, of inter-imperialist rivalry and war, while in the East, the October Revolution found an extraordinary echo thanks to the call to the quote slaves in the colonies to break the chains of oppression and national humiliation. Yeah, the slaves in the colonies. I guess maybe that is like the differing thing. Like people will argue that there is this working class here in the West, and I'm always talking about how it's just not the case. Like they're labor aristocrats. They do not live in literal third world global South conditions. They're not in sweatshops. There are people who are in prisons being used as slave labor, but that's the closest thing that we have here. And they have them locked up so tight that it's like it's just literally a penal colony if you're going to call that an internal colony, but it's not a revolutionary project. It's not like a colony that can revolt. So as long as the US maintains that, I don't know, like hard line between the people who are actual slaves and the wage slaves who still have it pretty good, there are no fucking revolutionary conditions here, and they're not coming. In the West, the nation state was the quote was the bloodthirsty Moloch that sacrificed millions of people to the greed for power and the interests of big business. In the East, it was a question of shaking off the colonial yoke and putting an end to the genocidal and enslaving practices used by the great capitalist powers against the quote barbarians. In the two zones into which the world was divided, imperialism was experienced in different ways. There is no contradiction, but rather a full convergence between these two aspects. But have Western and Eastern Marxism ever met? Has the first ever really grasped the second? Another consideration. I mean, I shouldn't pass by that question too quickly. Has Western Marxism ever really grasped Eastern Marxism? It's like you could say that's literally what I am trying to do with all these hours that I'm spending here. Um, like touting the successes and the history of Eastern Marxism as opposed to the stereotypes that Western Marxists have of it, by talking about the current success of places like China. Um, yeah, that's literally the entire thing that I'm trying to do is get Western Marxists to actually grasp Eastern Marxism, and it's pretty much an impossible project. Like you can see, I could spend like hours and hours and hours doing this, and people are just like kind of meh because of the colonial question, because they are treat the rights. Another consideration. Since the initial difficulties and tragedies of the system that emerged from the October Revolution became apparent, but especially since the crisis of, quote, real socialism became clear, the split between Eastern and Western Marxists has led to the fact that Marxists in power and Marxists in opposition, the latter increasingly focusing on critical theory, deconstruction, and also the condemnation of power and of power relations in general, are alien to each other. And so, quote, Western Marxism was born, which increasingly understood its distance from power as a favorable condition for the rediscovery of a, quote, authentic Marxism that was no longer reduced to a, quote, state ideology. But does this profound and perhaps arrogant self-confidence have a real basis? There is another often forgotten side of the coin. It could be said that Eastern Marxism was in a more favorable situation for understanding and appropriating an essential thesis of Marx. The profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization lies unveiled before our eyes, turning from its home where it assumes respectable forms to the colonies where it goes naked. Yeah, that's why people feel content to just sit here and argue amongst each other about the theoretical aspects of Marxism and how to best promote it, why they denounce the existing socialist countries, because they're doing so from their comfortable position living on slave labor. Western Marxism, on the other hand, has dealt almost exclusively with the quote respectable forms of bourgeois capitalist rule. If, however, the fate intended above all for the peoples in the colonies and of colonial origin is lost sight of, then the absolutely necessary criticism of quote real socialism results in banal liberal apologetics and in an undifferentiated liquidation of the history of communism of the 20th century. The development of Lucio Coletti, pupil of Della Volpe, is illuminating. But no less significant is the conduct of two authors who are still considered leading figures. Speaking of Stalin's Soviet Union, implicitly of all countries that had to bow to the logic of quote socialism in one country, Hart and Negri write, quote, "It is a tragic irony that the nationalist socialism in Europe came to resemble National Socialism, because the abstract machine of national sovereignty is at the heart of both. In this reckless historical balance, the colonial or semi-colonial peoples continue to play no role." Yeah, once again, just like equating fascism and socialism, like for what purpose, other than to entirely leave out their opposite roles with respect to the global South and actual minorities, like actually oppressed people. Here, the two countries are calmly placed side by side and on an equal footing, the first of which has given a powerful impulse to the process of decolonization, while the second set out to inherit and radicalize the colonial tradition, even considering it to be applicable to Eastern Europe. If we consider the colonial world, the historical balance of the 20th century looks very different from what the ruling ideology would prefer, and so also today the veterans of quote Western Marxism. If we focus exclusively on quote formal democracy, that is, on the rule of law and the classical freedoms of the liberal tradition, it must be said that the societies that emerged from the October Revolution went into a tailspin and eventually eliminated any form of democracy. And yet, at the time, they stimulated the desire for democracy and emancipation, for recognition. They stimulated the demands of the peoples. They stimulated the demands of the peoples in the colonies or on the periphery of the capitalist metropolis. In the case of colonies or semi-colonies, it was precisely the bourgeois democratic metropolis that stifled democratic claims with blood. I'm going to bookmark this one here. I'm pretty sure I'm at 40 minutes. Yeah. So now I'll switch over to the third book. That is The Soviets Expected It. Sorry, let me make this a little bigger. I don't know. Okay. So we had left off on a section called The Pact That Blocked Hitler. So this is talking about basically dispelling all the myths that the Soviet Union corroborated or collaborated with Hitler in any way that wasn't like purely strategic and like obviously successful, as we can see from history. But continuing here, Hitler's own statement is as follows. While our soldiers from May 5th, 1940 on had been breaking Franco-British power in the West, Russian military deployment on our eastern frontier was being continued to a more and more menacing extent. From August 1940 on, I therefore considered it to be in the interest of the Reich no longer to permit our eastern provinces to remain unprotected in the face of this tremendous concentration of Bolshevist divisions. Thus, there resulted British-Soviet-Russian cooperation intended mainly at the tying up of such powerful forces in the East that radical conclusion of the war in the West, particularly as regards aircraft, could no longer be vouched for by the German High Command. So, end quote from Hitler there. The Red Army's march into Bessarabia was thus, according to Hitler, the chief thing that saved Britain from invasion. He may be exaggerating somewhat to make a case. He is certainly overstating, quote, the British and Russian cooperation that he claims was behind the Soviet move. The Soviets marched into Bessarabia to strengthen themselves and not to strengthen Britain. They knew, however, and probably Churchill did, that they were helping to save Britain as well. Nothing can be more certain than that the Soviet leaders, for all their long antagonism to the British Empire, did not want to see the tremendous aggrandizement of Hitler that a successful invasion of Britain would entail. In this, their point of view was singularly like that of Winston Churchill. Whatever the past and however hateful the ideology, whoever fought Hitler was becoming their ally. Yeah, I mean, any port in a storm, right? In a certain sense, what Hitler called, quote, cooperation between Russia and Britain really began in the summer of 1940, with Churchill's accession to power in May and the Soviet march into Bessarabia in June. The tremendous strength of the German armies and the speed with which they crashed through the various countries of Europe worried not only Britain, it worried the Russians also. I heard such worries expressed in the autumn of 1940 in Moscow. Objectively, the two countries henceforth began to have a common interest in promoting anything that thwarted Hitler. Even subjectively, that summer was the turning point, for the Russians believed that Churchill really intended to fight Hitler rather than use him to fight the Soviets, as Chamberlain had wished. From that time on, therefore, a certain cooperation actually began, unorganized or organized only by the instinct of a common goal. Hitler had everything to lose by actual war in the Balkans. He relied on the Balkans as an economic base. It was to his interest to control them by economic penetration, or if necessary, to seize them by a rapid, quote, blitzkrieg type of war. It was very much against his interest to destroy the harvests and the industries of the Balkans by any serious conflict. Two important events, the number two important events had disturbed the Balkans as an economic base for Hitler. The Soviet march into Bessarabia, which both took territory and deeply stirred the anti-Nazi forces in all of Eastern Europe, and Mussolini's attack on Greece, which disrupted the Balkans without subduing them. Mm. Hmm. The German drive to the Balkans, for which Hitler abandoned the proposed invasion of Britain, had therefore these goals: to smash the British-Greek armies as rapidly as possible, to consolidate the whole Balkan Peninsula against the Soviet Union, and eventually to seize the eastern Mediterranean and the Suez Canal by an advance through both Africa and Turkey. Instead of attacking the British Isles, Hitler would attack the British Empire. He especially needed swift access to the oil and other riches of the Middle East. American aid was increasingly flowing into Britain, and it looked like a long-time conflict. The drive was therefore on for oil. Quote, from that time on, declares von Ribbentrop, quote, Soviet Russia's anti-German policy began to become steadily more apparent. Thus he formulates the fact that Hitler's drive into the Balkans met increasing resistance from the USSR. The friction was so obvious that the whole world remarked it. Among its outer signs were the Soviet censure of the Bulgarian government for capitulating to Hitler, the Soviet non-aggression pact with Yugoslavia, the endorsement by the Soviet press of Greek and Yugoslav military resistance, the Soviet statement to Turkey that any act of resistance to the German passage of troops would be, quote, sympathetically understood by the USSR. Besides these open acts of the Soviet Union, the statements by Hitler and von Ribbentrop have now revealed that the Soviets protested to Germany against the sending of German troops into Bulgaria, that the USSR proposed an alliance to Bulgaria, which the pro-Nazi Bulgarian government refused, and that Soviet determination to prevent German armies from crossing the Dardanelles was a serious and perhaps deciding factor in causing Turkey to refuse their passage. Conflict between Hitler and the Soviets sharpened in Yugoslavia. Here, Britain and the USSR found themselves in active, even if unorganized, cooperation. Von Ribbentrop charges that the USSR, quote, secretly assisted Yugoslavia in arming against the Axis powers from November 19, 1940 on. He claims that the sudden overthrow of the government in Yugoslavia after it had agreed to let the German troops pass through unopposed was inspired in part by Great Britain, but more by the USSR. After the Serbian government fell, according to von Ribbentrop, quote, almost 200 Yugoslav aircraft carrying Soviet, Russian, and British agents were flown off, partly to Russia. These officers are today serving in the Russian army, and partly to Egypt. It is an interesting detail, if true. Yeah, big if true. You'll have to see it, though. In any event, it was true that both Britain and the USSR did what they could to inspire and help the Yugoslav resistance. The Serbs were crushed by the might of the German armies, but the fact that they resisted spoiled Hitler's plan to use Yugoslavia as his highway into Greece. Yugoslavia is today useless to Hitler, through the internal struggles that were chiefly inspired by the Soviets. I myself knew in Moscow in late autumn of 1940 that the Soviets were sending food to both Greece and Yugoslavia. In all of this, and even in the shipping of the alleged armaments, the Soviet Union was within its rights as a neutral nation and within the Non Aggression Pact. To enable a Balkan state to protect itself against invasion could be called an act of aggression only by a Nazi imperialist. Hitler achieved important success in his drive to the Balkans and into Africa. He crushed the Greeks and drove the British army into the sea from southern Greece and Crete. He smashed Yugoslavia and terrorized Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria into abject submission. He drove General Wavell out of Libya. Nonetheless, he failed in his major objective, which was Mosul oil and the Suez Canal. The chief factor in his failure was the Soviet Union, whose pressure on Turkey, when added to the British pressure, prevented the German armies from crossing the Dardanelles. Again, the Soviet Union, in saving herself, was also saving Britain. The, quote, Anglo-Russian conspiracy, as Hitler plaintively called it, was really beginning to work. Hitler's march to the east so menaced the interests of both these nations that without an alliance, perhaps without even a mutual conference, they were acting in accord. Only the future will show what went on in tight little Turkey under the pressures of Germany, Britain, and the USSR. It was clear at least that Hitler had reached the Turkish borders, and the world's commentators predicted that his next move would be against the Dardanelles. Instead of this, he chose a long and difficult way southward, fighting through Greece and then proceeding by water jump to Crete. It looked as if he might achieve a new road to Suez by parachutists from island to island. Possibly these island jumps proved too costly. Possibly, as some think, Hitler became convinced through Rudolf Hess that England would in part support him if he turned against the Bolsheviks. All that we know now is that the fall of Suez was expected by military experts, as the invasion of Britain had been expected the previous year. Hitler's forces were said to be already in Syria. They had gone instead in the other direction to the borders of the USSR. Hitler saw at last that while the greatest ultimate foe of German expansion is the Anglo-American joint empire, which holds the seas and most of the continents of the world, yet the most immediate barrier in his march toward world domination was that neutral country, the USSR. Under the Non-Aggression Pact and using its position as a neutral nation, the Soviet Union, in the 22 months of the pact's duration, had checked Nazi expansion more than it was checked by all of Europe's armed forces: Polish, Norwegian, Dutch, Belgian, French, Greek, Yugoslav, and British combined. Not once in that time had Soviet policy harmed in any way the German people, yet steadily it had thwarted the Nazi imperialist advance. 3 times especially this had happened. The Soviet march into Poland checked for a year the German advance to the east. The Soviet march into Bessarabia and into the Baltic states caused Hitler, by his own account, to abandon the invasion of Britain. The complex power politics of the Soviets in the Balkans prevented Hitler's drive through the Dardanelles. Yeah, that's probably just like the quickest summary that you could supply for that whole thing. Like when people try to say, "What about fucking Molotov-Ribbentrop or whatever?" The pact between the USSR and Hitler. It's like, what about it? They still did more to fight the Nazis than anybody else combined. Could the USSR have done so much as partner of Chamberlain's Britain? Not if Chamberlain had remained at the helm. The history of his promises and betrayals justifies the Soviet conviction that he would have left them alone to fight an onslaught from Europe and Asia. Nay, more, that Britain, France, and America would have been banker and arsenal for the anti-Soviet war. Yeah, absolutely. It would have been giving the Germans money and weapons to fight the Soviets for them. But if the Soviets could have made an alliance with that other Britain, which later threw out Chamberlain, then they might indeed have done more than they did alone as a neutral. Acting in time and with determination, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union might have stopped the Second World War. Yeah, if the West had actually wanted to do that, if they cared about stopping Hitler more than they cared about stopping communism. As it was, the USSR's lone neutral hand blocked Hitler's immediate plans for expansion more than did the combination of Hitler's open foes. Hitler therefore turned and struck at the Soviet Union in the mightiest assault of human history. Yeah, so that brings us to chapter 14 here. War of the Whole People. Quote, the greatest military march in the world's history, end quote, was the claim made by Adolf Hitler as his army struck at the Soviet Union in a surprise attack at dawn on June 22, 1941. This was no overstatement. By that dawn, By that dawn onslaught, the world's two largest armies were locked in the most decisive struggle mankind has ever known. For nearly a year, Germany had laid the groundwork for this invasion. Sorry. After the Red Army marched into Bessarabia and Hitler turned east, 100 German divisions were kept continuously along the Russo-German border. Many strategic roads were built in Poland. By occupying Romania and later by sending large units to Finland, the Germans gained access to the whole 1,800-mile Soviet frontier. The German army attacked with full strength along the whole length of this border, equivalent to the Canadian border from Vancouver to Buffalo. Thousands of German planes smashed at Soviet airfields before their occupants knew that a war was on. Hordes of German bombers and tanks led the hitherto unbeatable German military machine, striking in the north from Finland toward Leningrad and the Arctic port of Murmansk, in the center from Poland and the Baltic states toward Moscow, and in the south from Romania toward Kiev, Odessa, and the wheat and oil beyond. I mean, it's crazy how much, like, whenever people talk about just like Ukraine, they just talk about it as a breadbasket. Or maybe here they mention oil. Hitler claimed, perhaps accurately, that 9 million armed men were actively engaged. In both countries, millions more waited as reserves. The prevailing view in Berlin, London, and Washington was that Russian resistance would be smashed by a, quote, 1-month blitz. Isn't that a tale as old as time? Don't you love hearing them say that, the Russians, they'll be smashed in a month. They can never hold up in a war of attrition. It's like famous last words. Even before the war, some of our best-known columnists tried to tell Hitler that the USSR was easy and valuable prey. That's apparently Walter Lippmann in the New York Herald Tribune, March 6, 1941, suggested that Hitler should use his army against Russia, quote, which is easy to conquer and well worth conquering. And Leland Stowe from Chicago Daily News said that Ukraine is the only, that continues somewhere, the only comparatively cheap and remunerative blitzkrieg that Hitler can now find anywhere. Oh my God, it continues on, like more of them. The footnotes go on for like several pages. So yeah, it was not only predicted that the Red Army would be rapidly smashed, but that peasants would revolt and that sections of the USSR would set up puppet governments under Hitler. And again, I love the fucking hubris of these people that think that communism is not democracy or that people don't like being under communism. They fucking do. They love it. A fortnight after the war began, Washington cautiously admitted that the, quote, Russians have put up the strongest resistance the Germans have met. Later, the press was saying, quote, so far the Russians have done the incredible. They have stalled the German Wehrmacht. After 6 weeks of fighting, a swift reevaluation of the Soviet Union began both in America and Britain. Prime Minister Churchill said in his August 24th broadcast, quote, the Russians fight with magnificent devotion. Not only that, our generals who have visited the Russian front line report with admiration the efficiency of their military organization and the excellence of their equipment. War correspondents in Europe began to say that the fighting was, quote, the hardest the world has ever seen, that the Germans had found in the Soviet people, quote, a new type of enemy and a new type of war. Hell yeah. The first evaluation of the war from Soviet sources was made in Stalin's radio address to the people 2 weeks after the war began. Stalin said that the Germans had already taken considerable territory. He clearly implied that they were going to take more. For a while, he ordered the Red Army to, quote, defend every inch of Soviet soil. He also told what must be done, quote, in case of forced retreat, and, quote, in areas occupied by the enemy. He gave instructions for orderly evacuation in which collective farms would participate, thus implying that the Germans would go further than the buffer belt, which had few collective farms. It was later rumored in Washington that Stalin even told Harry Hopkins that Kiev might have to be evacuated. If true, this was not surprising, for Kiev is very vulnerable. In the earlier wars of intervention, it changed hands 17 times. Stalin told his people that the German army was not invincible and that there was no excuse for, quote, panic mongering. There are no invincible armies and never have been. However, the enemy is, quote, implacable, armed to the teeth with tanks and aircraft, and the Soviet people must understand, quote, the full immensity of the danger. The Germans had gained an important military advantage by the surprise attack, which hurled 170 divisions against the USSR, quote, in a state of complete readiness where Soviet troops had still to effect mobilization. Factors which Stalin knew, but for diplomatic reasons did not mention, were the experience gained by the German war machine in 2 years of victory, and the enormous reserves of war supplies and armament factories taken over intact by Hitler in Europe from the Great Skoda Works, which he got as a gift from Chamberlain to the stores of American planes, uh, to the stores of American planes and munitions secured through the collapse of France. It would take some time for the USSR to overcome these handicaps, but Stalin seemed confident of the ultimate outcome. He summoned the Soviet people not merely to resolute resistance, but, quote, forward to victory. Yeah. Which, as we know, it ended up panning out. But yeah, I'm going to bookmark this one here. And then, as always, I will pick up again next time. We will talk about this paragraph continuing the larger strategy of the war, implied in Stalin's analysis, was soon elaborated by military experts in all lands. Don't you love it when you have communism and you can actually direct massive endeavors of the state and the entire populace because you actually have like a collective authority? It's cool. We'd love to see it, folks. All right. Well, as always, thank you again. And I will see you next time. See you, folks.